Good God, this music. Okay. If you're gonna drop that in the middle of anything, well, fuck you. Alright. Back to looking for fucking copyright, royalty-free, spooky atmosphere music. Shit. Royalty free. But it's only 2 minutes long. God damn it. I want to give you guys something. Alright. Rain sounds. Meditation. Meditation is always scary. You can't fucking copyright the rain. Hey, Edgehead. Alright. So. This is gonna look like garbage. Fair warning. Okay, good. You guys are just gonna have to live with seeing chat on stream. Oh. And I'll just link it in case garbage. But I really don't think they're gonna fucking strike me for this. Today, and probably tomorrow too, we'll be doing scary stories. And today I'm gonna be reading from one of Tenchi's favorite books ever, the Necronomicon. And I'll just be going through it randomly as I feel like, for as long as I feel like. I forgot to sell out on Discord, so Discord doesn't know that I'm doing this, 'cause I suck. Alright. Time for spooks. Yeah, they should know. So, we're gonna get started. For those of you who don't know anything about the Necronomicon, it's from, Alright, I'm not gonna look in Discord now. Is it time to post? It was time to post when I made the post, dog. Alright, alright, so the Necronomicon is from H.P. Lovecraft, who was kind of a dick while he was alive. I'm not gonna mince words, he was kind of a dick. But I enjoy his writing. You can learn valuable things from people who are a dick. I see a Wolfie streaming, I immediately click. Chaos Dragoon. Yeah, so we're gonna be reading from the Necronomicon. And then if people have requests over the course of the week, I'll make time to stream. Tomorrow, I will be streaming probably more spooky, scary stuff. Spooky stories stuff. And for those of you who are in the server, Edgehead you can pull out if you want to, but Edgehead has agreed, and actually has requested, to have their tarot reading live in the server. So I will be doing that as we do it, I guess, and anyone can pop in who's curious about the process and totally free. Don't need to worry about that. But yeah, the reading will be at 7 New York time, PM. And then I'll probably start streaming it around 8 to do more different kind of reading. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Not pulling out of it, you're actually a little excited. Oh, hell yeah. But yeah, oh, right, life stuff. Got my ultrasound today. Nothing is obviously wrong, so I might just be better now, which is great. I'm still gonna take it a little easy on myself, because I don't want to fucking break myself. But, you know, that's life. But yeah, Necronomicon, HP Lovecraft. I'm going into this blind, but, like, it's legit. Like, it's a thing that people have heard of. Yeah, so if I don't read what you put in chat immediately, it's because I'm voice acting. And I get into it. But yeah, if anybody wants to follow it along, follow along with it, I'm pretty sure you can read it online for free? Like, and follow along if you guys really want to. But this is kind of an audiobook, so you don't really have to worry about that. If reading spooky stories, could we submit something? Submitted a few years ago already. Yeah, I would read it tomorrow. I would read submissions tomorrow. I might read the one that I read last year and the year before if people still want that one. I haven't written another one since then. I probably should, but I haven't gotten around to it. But yeah. Just, I made the channel in the, server for it. You just drop the link there, and and it could be something you wrote, it could be from Reddit, just, like, don't, like, Monka TOS. I'll just beware the terms of service. But that shouldn't be an issue. Alright, so I'm gonna get started with the first entry thingy. Alright. Is the music okay? Like, I could probably try harder to find something better than this, but let's try this. I don't know why, but for some reason meditation tunes, like, fucking weird me out. Alright. We're going to start with... Let's see here. Love the sound of rain, so you're good either way. Why not both? I could do that for you. Alright, is everyone all snuggled in? Is everyone ready? Let's go. Jesus Christ, the fucking credits on this thing is forever. Alright. So the first thing is called Night Gaunts. Out of what crypt they crawl, I cannot tell, but every night I see the rubbery things, black, horned, and slender, with membranous wings. They come in legions on the north wind's swell, with obscene clutch that titillates and stings, snatching me off on monstrous voyagings. to grey worlds, hidden deep in nightmare as well. Over the jagged peaks of Thok they sweep, heedless of all the cries I try to make, and down the nether pits to that foul lake, where the puffed shoggoths splash in doubtful sleep. But ho, if only they would make some sound, or where faces should be found. Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight shall be no more. Penniless and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think, from my slavery to morphine, that I am a weakling or a degenerate. You have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all of the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken I managed to escape alone, in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a confident navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no islands or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shore of some hospitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I was asleep. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might imagine, well, that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing within sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black, in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking, or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of fish was so maddening, but I was much too concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock, which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting out in a sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound, and looked down on the other side into an immeasurable pit, or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost, and Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I imagined. Ledges and outcropping of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual, urged on by an impulse which I definitely cannot analyze. I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose deeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the new bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone I had surely assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude, and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of the conventionalized aquatic symbols, such as fish, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, was an array of bas-reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, for the creatures were shown disporting like fish in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine, which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and their forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of Poe or Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly, out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but a little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or the Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck as this unexpected glimpse into the past beyond conception of the most daring anthropologist. Wow. I stood musing, whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight turning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, and while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the sloping cliff and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in San Francisco Hospital. brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon such a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought a great celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not have all been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may, at this very moment, be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day where they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink, and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense, slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window. The window. Now, I will pause to read chat. Chat did not move. Sweet. Yeah, I'm not gonna be reading all of it in order. Not gonna read all of it in order. I'm just gonna run around and sort of go through the table of contents as I see fit. Sorry that my voice is a little crackly and, like, raw. I haven't been doing much talking lately, but I think it adds a certain quality to it. I think it adds a certain quality of it. Hold on. I got a work email that I need to look at just to make sure it's no emergency. Okay. Oh, I can access that later. That's all fine. Alright. Still here, just listening? Good. Yeah, I hope you don't mind this. I don't usually do this, but it's a tradition, especially on Halloween week, that I read spooky stories. Let's go with for tomorrow. Okay, sweet. Sweet. Let's go with the music of Eric San. The music of Eric San. I've examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet never again found the Rue d'Auxil. I'm probably butchering the fucking pronunciation of that name. Fuck me. Love when you read spooky stories. I actually have the new one for tomorrow I forgot about. Oh, hell yeah, Chaos. Sorry, I fucking interrupted myself because I was just like, oh, this is French. I don't do French. Oh no. But, yeah, no. So long as you guys are having a blast of it, I'm doing the good. Alright, yeah, neat. I'm going to continue. Fuck, I lost the tab. There it is. Okay. I examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet never again found the Rue d'Auxil. I'm just gonna call it the Rue d'Auxil. It's R-U-E space D'-A-U-S-E-I-L. Rue d'Auxil. I'm just gonna call it the Rue d'Auxil. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all of the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as the Rue d'Auxil. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, that's your first problem, I heard the music of Eric San. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in Rue d'Auxil, and I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But I cannot find the place again. It's both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half-hour's walk of the university, and was distinguished by peculiarities that could hardly be forgotten by anyone who'd been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue d'Auxil. The Rue d'Auxil lay across a dark river bordered by precipitous, brick, blear-windowed warehouses and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if the smoke of the neighboring factory shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also so odorous with evil stenches which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may someday help me to find it, since I should recognize them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual but incredibly steep, as the Rue d'Auxil was reached. I've never seen another street as narrow and as steep as the Rue d'Auxil. It was almost a cliff, closed to all vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps, and ending at the top in a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, other times cobblestones, and sometimes bare earth, with struggling greenish-gray vegetation. The houses were tall, peak-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backward, forward, and almost sideways. Occasionally an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost met across the street like an arch. And certainly they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of the street impressed me peculiarly. At first I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself. When I moved there, I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue d'Auxil, kept by the paralytic Blandot. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My room was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. The night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day I asked old Blandot about it. He told me it was an old German viola player, a strange dumb man who signed his name as Ersan, and who played evenings in a cheap theater orchestra, adding that Zan's desire to play and the night after his return from the theater was the reason he'd chosen this lofty and isolated garret room, whose single gable window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall, the declivity, and panorama beyond. Thereafter, I heard Zan every night. And although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music that I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zan in the hallway and told him I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque satyr-like face, and nearly bald head, and at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking, and rickety attic stairs. His room, one of only two in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, toward the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great. It seemed greater because of its extraordinary barrenness and neglect. The furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead and a dingy washstand, a small table, and large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and probably had never known plaster. Wheels with the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Ersan's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his viol from the moth-eaten covering, and, taking it, seated himself in the least comfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but, offering no choice, and playing from memory, enchanted me for over an hour with strains I'd never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They were a kind of fugue, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard from my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and had often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself. So when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled satyr-like face lost the bored placidity it had possessed during the playing, and seemed to show the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when I first accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility. I even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had heard the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment. For when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a startled glance toward the lone curtained window, as if fearful of some intruder. A glance doubly absurd, since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all adjacent roofs. This window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall of the summit. The old man's glance brought Blandot's remark to mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look out over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers in their dazzle only this crabbed musician could see. I moved toward the window, and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains when with a frightened rage, even greater than before, the dumb lodger was upon me again, this time motioning with his head toward the door as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me, and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offense, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair. Then, with the appearance of a wistfulness, crossing to the littered table, where he wrote many words with a pencil, in the labored French of a foreigner. The note which he handed me, finally, was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zahn said he was lonely, old, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders that connected with his music and other things. He'd enjoyed my listening to his music, and wished I would come again and not mind his eccentricities, but he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I could arrange with Blandot to take a lower room where I could not hear him at night. It would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the execrable French, I felt more lenient toward the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, and as was I. My metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Hassan. So when I finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Blandot gave me a more expensive room on the third floor, between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the fourth floor. It was not long before I found that Zahn's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed. While he was persuading me to move down from the fifth story, he did not ask me to call on him. And when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window, over the wall and down the unseen slope, at the glittering roofs and spires which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during theatre hours, when Zahn was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear a nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to my old fifth floor. Then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There, in the narrow hall, outside the bolted door, with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with indefinable dread. The dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly Zahn was a genius of wild power, As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old man acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened to the door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that barred portal a piteous proof that the horror was real. The awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear or anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterwards, I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, until I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after the fainting fit, I renewed my rapping, at the same time calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zahn stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumbled to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief, while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at his mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair, whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me, in the name of mercy and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was while he prepared a full account in German of all of the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old man's feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zahn start, as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I had a fancy I heard a sound myself. It was not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighboring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zahn, the effect was terrible. For dropping his pencil, suddenly he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erasan on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I'd ever heard, because I could now see the expression on his face. I could realize that this time of motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off, or drown something out. What I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be, the playing grew fantastic, delirious and hysterical, yet kept to the last of the qualities of supreme genius which I knew this strange old man possessed. I recognized the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance popular in the theaters, and I reflected for a moment that this was the first time I'd ever heard Zahn play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dripping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through seething abysses of clouds and smoke and lightning, and then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. this juncture, the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind, which had sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zan's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke shiveringly under persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zan had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zan and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blind, mechanical, unrecognizable orgy that no pen could even suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it toward the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window. The only window in the Rudazzel, from which one might see the slope beyond the wall, and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from that highest of all gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, and no friendly lights gleamed from the remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable, unimagined space, alive with motion and music, and having no semblance of anything on earth. As I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both the candles in that ancient peaked garret, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night-baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without means of striking a light, crashing against table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Derek Zan, I could at least try, whatever the powers opposed to me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard over that hideous viol. Suddenly, out of the blackness, the madly sawing bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt a head touch the back of Zan's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder. In an effort to bring him to his senses, he did not respond, and still the viol shrieked on without slackening. I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music. All while through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and the babble. My hand touched his ear. I shuddered, though I knew not why. I knew not why until I felt his still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then by some miracle finding the door, and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed viol whose fury increased even as I plunged, leaping, floating, flying down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing mindlessly out of the narrow, steep, and ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattered down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets and the putrid Callan-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me. And I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I've never since been able to find the Rudazzel. but I'm not wholly sore either. Either for this, or for the loss of the undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets, which alone could have explained the music of Erich-san. That was a good one. I liked that one. We'll do one or two more. We'll do one or two more, and then I'll get myself some rest. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. I know I can get a little dramatic when I read. I hope it's not, like, off-putting. I'm not actually in a mania when I read. I just get really into characters sometimes. Good lord, my throat's gonna fucking hate me later. Alright. I saw one called The Hound. That one seems appropriate. The Hound. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a distant, faint baying, as of some gigantic hound. It is not a dream. It is not, I fear, even madness, for too much has already happened to give me those merciful doubts. St. John's is a mangled corpse, I alone know why. And such is my knowledge that I'm about to blow my brains out. For fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down, unlit, and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the black, nameless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate, wearied with the commonplaces of a prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventures soon grow stale. St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites all were ours in their time, but each new mood was drained too soon for its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could help us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only one more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity. That hideous extremity of human outrage. The abhorred practice of grave robbing. Can't reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. The museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, wherewith the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosity we assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room far, far underground, where huge winged demons, carven of basalt and onyx, vomited from wide grinning mouths weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death, the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors our moods most craved. Sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, now I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies alternating with comely lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes, and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting, bald plates of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. The statues and paintings were there, all of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio bound in tanned human skin held certain unknown and unnameable drawings which were rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass, and woodwind, from which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cagademonical ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tumult ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot, in particular, that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it, long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghosts, but worked only under certain conditions of the mood: landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details of fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John's was always leader, and he was the one who led the way at last to that mocking, accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured into that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor that then legendary. The tales that of one of 5 buried centuries. Whoops, I scrambled that shit. I think it was dark rumor and legendary. The tales of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time, and stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in the final moments. These final moments. The pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long and horrible shadows, their grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and crumbling slabs. The vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon. The antique, ivied church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky, the phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner, the odors of mold, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over swamps and seas, and worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see more definitely place. As we heard the suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry. For he whom we sought had centuries before been found in the self-same spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remember now how he delved in the ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently mooning night wind, and the strange, half-heard directionless baying, whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold, and beheld the rotting oblong box, crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull, its long, firm teeth, and its eyeless sockets that once glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound, or sphinx with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in the antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression of its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John or I could identify, and on the bottom, like a maker's seal, it was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon holding the amulet, we knew that we must possess it. This treasure alone was our logical perf. From the century grave, even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it. But as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul Azharid. Sorry, I butchered your name. Abdul al-Hazred, the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-feeding cult of the inaccessible lung in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineage described by the old Arab demonologist, lineaments, he wrote, drawn by some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened in the aberrant spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background. But the autumn wind moaned, and sad and wan. and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone, without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of a visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be a frequent fumbling in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the window of the library when the moon was shining against it. At another time, we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing. We began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination, which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we'd heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned a strangely scented candle before it. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about its properties and about the relations of ghost souls to objects it symbolized, and we were disturbed by what we read. Then terror came. On the night of September the 24th, 19 I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. I roused St. John from his sleep. He professed entire ignorance of the event, and became as worried as I. It was the night that faintly distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to our secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for, besides our fear of the unknown, we'd always entertained in dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door, and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air, and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rusting, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to return. We only realized with the blackest of apprehensions that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess. And every night that demonic baying rolled over the wind-swept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29th, we found in the soft earth beneath the library window a series of footprints, utterly impossible to describe. They were baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18th, when St. John, walking home after dark from the dismal railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was whisper. The amulet. That damned thing. Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens, and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demonic sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And what I saw, a dim-lighted moor, a wide, nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound. I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground when I rose, trembling. I know not how much long later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisance before this enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house among the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet, after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights I heard the baying again, and before a week was over I felt a strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind, stronger than the night wind, rushed by, and I knew that what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner I knew not, but I felt that I must try any step conceivably logical. What that hound was and why it pursued me were questions still vague, but I had first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with stealing the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when, in an inn at Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest crime in the neighborhood. In the squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace. And those around had heard all night a faint, deep, insistent note, as of a gigantic hound. So at last I stood again in the unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees stood solemnly to meet the withered, frosty glass and cracking slabs. The ivied church pointed a jeering finger at an unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither unless to pray, or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption. and a lean vulture darted out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth, until I killed him with a bow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouched within that century coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of large, sinewy, sleepling bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed, not clean and placed as we'd seen it, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me, with phosphorescent sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay, as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and fateful amulet of green jade. I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night-black rooms of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed webbed wings circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnamable. Don't go graveyard robbing, folks. Is the bad. But yeah, that's all I have for tonight. We may pick up the Necronomicon, or some old folk tales later on in the week. But my voice rebels against me now. And I should push it no further. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Spoopy Hazer, what's up? Yeah. The VOD will stay up. But yeah, spooky stories by request tomorrow night. If you want to see something interesting at 7 New York time, I will be doing a live tarot reading on the server for our one and only Edgehead. And that'll be at 7, and at 8 I will probably resume my reading. We have a few requests already, just put them in the Discord if you want to. If we want to continue after those have been exhausted, I'll pick up the Necronomicon, or I'll read some old Irish stories maybe. We'll see. But my voice is dying right now. I can hear it. So I'm gonna call it here. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that, hope it was a good time for y'all. And, Necronomicon is very different, very eerie. Yeah, Lovecraft has like a very particular flavor to him. He was very much bothered by what he could not understand. While he was alive, he was a racist. He was genuinely scared of, I think it was black people. And he was just very, very scared of the unknown. And it comes off in his writing in very peculiar ways. And I like it because we're surrounded by the unknown. Science, and I mean I'm biased because I'm a scientist, I am a biologist. Science can only answer so many questions, and there's still so much we don't understand. And that's scary. We know very little about... We know less about some of the chasms in our oceans than we do about some of the planets and moons and asteroids in our solar system. We're still understanding the nature of time. And there's so much that can't be explained. And that's scary. But it's also beautiful. And it's also necessary. Reality is not always this very cut and dry. Everything is known. Everything makes sense. A lot of it doesn't make any sense. And scrambling to make sense of certain random patterns can drive a person mad. And there's a beauty to that. There's a beauty to just giving up and saying, I don't understand, and I'm scared, and this is fantastic. Because with that comes acceptance, and humility, and connectedness. That in arrogance and illusions of omnipotency and infinite ability we would otherwise deprive ourselves of. And that's why I like Lovecraft. Because it speaks to things very eloquently that I think that other people have more trouble expressing. And even though his viewpoint on the unknown is far different than mine, there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of truly thoughtful description that he gives that I want to write like him one day. I do. And when I'm passably done with my grimoire, I'll probably try my hand at spooky stories like that. But I think I will start by studying Lovecraft. before I pick up my pen. I was working for a long time on a project called The Matriarch, which I've paused because I need to wait until my mental health is a little better before I continue with that. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Lovecraft. Yeah. But we will continue spooky story reading at another time. For now, those of you that are left, I'll probably throw you over to Sneaky. He's a good friend of mine. And, yeah. In the meantime, do not eat or drink any questionable substances. Make smart decisions to not die. Dying is absolutely forbidden, and I will see all of you wonderful people at a later time. Take care, guys.